Hou hom met die stem, hou hom met die koel, hou hom met die kanon, hou hom in godsnaam, want jy het geen reg om hom te oorhandig aan die communiste van die ANC. Dit is God se land. Ons land nie, ons sal die ANC gelyk maak met wapengeweld in hierdie land voor hulle.
He believed South Africa had been stolen, that history had betrayed his people, that democracy was not freedom but surrender.
They don't want us in this country. This is our country. We have built everything here. And they will not take it from us. If they want war, they will get war.
It's just a few number of people, so they cannot disrupt this country. Yes, the masses can do it, but not AWB.
We'll just have to wait and see what transpires. I do believe that we have got a very good, rich country with all our sunshine, also very spacious. There should be place for everybody to live in peace.
To his followers, he was a general. To his critics, a relic of a dying world. To the nation, he was proof that the past does not disappear quietly. He wore symbols from a future that was not coming back. He spoke of war in a country preparing for peace, and he built a movement fueled by fear in a nation trying to heal. But time does not negotiate, and on a quiet farm in Venterdrop,
the self-proclaimed white supremacist was bludgeoned to death while he slept. He was 69 years old.
The man who refused to accept South Africa's future met an end as violent as the world he tried to hold on to. This is the story of Eugene Terre Blanch and what happens when ideology outlives reality.
Hou jou pote af van die boere se grond.
On 31st January 1941, in the small farming town of Venterdrop, a child was born into a country that was still deciding what it was and who it belonged to. His name was Eugene Terre Blanch. He was born into an Afrikaner household, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked into the South African interior centuries earlier, carrying with them a language, a Calvinist faith, and a memory of loss. The Anglo-Boer War was not ancient history in Afrikaner homes. It was spoken about at dinner tables. It was mourned in silence. It was remembered as humiliation. For many Afrikaners, identity was forged in defeat and then rebuilt in political victory.
They've been called the lost white tribe of Africa. Their peculiar genius has been survival. Against all odds, they have clung doggedly to the portion of Africa they claim as their own.
When the National Party came to power in 1948 and formalized apartheid, it was not simply a policy shift. To many Afrikaners, it was restoration, a reclaiming, a promise that their culture, language, and authority would never again be subordinated in their own land. Young Eugene grew up inside that promise.
We as Afrikaners, as the most important decision makers, must create the necessary safeguard that the society as it is must be continued, that our existence as whites in Africa.
Afrikaner nationalism in the 1950s and 60s was not fringe. It was institutional. It lived in schools, churches, police barracks, and parliament. It was preached as divine order, a belief that separate development was not cruelty but survival. That history had taught them one lesson: power must never slip from your hands again. And so the system felt permanent. Terre Blanch attended school in a country where the flag, the anthem, the curriculum all reinforced one narrative. This land had been carved, defended, and built by Afrikaners. He absorbed that story not as ideology but as truth. In his early adulthood, he joined the South African police, the enforcement arm of that very system. The uniform did more than grant authority. It confirmed belonging. Law and order were not abstract concepts. They were guardians of a civilization he believed fragile beneath the surface. But by the late 1970s and into the 1980s, something began to shift. Sanctions tightened, protests intensified, armed resistance grew, international pressure mounted, the townships burned on television screens. For many white South Africans, particularly conservative Afrikaners, the future no longer felt guaranteed. Fear does not always arrive as panic. Sometimes it comes as erosion. The government that once spoke with absolute certainty began negotiating. Words like reform and power sharing entered public discourse. For some, it was progress. For others, it was betrayal. To understand Terre Blanch, you have to understand this moment. A generation raised to believe their dominance was ordained, suddenly confronted with its impermanence. He did not initially see himself as radical. In his mind, he was standing still while the world moved left. He believed he was defending language, land, and lineage, defending what his parents had trusted would endure. The theme of his life begins here. An identity shaped by a system that felt eternal, and a man who mistook its collapse for extinction. To those who opposed him, he would become a symbol of extremism. But to himself, he was something else entirely, a guardian at a shrinking gate, a nationalist born from certainty, who would spend the rest of his life fighting the idea that certainty could die.
1, 2, 3.
My message to the ANC's, never try to put your hands on this fatherland we paid too dearly for it.
By the early 1970s, Eugene Terre Blanch was no longer just a man concerned with preserving his identity. He had become a leader, and the world around him was changing faster than he could control. In 1973, he founded the AWB, which translated to the Afrikaner Resistance Movement. It was not just a political organization. It was a movement built on symbols, rituals, and the promise of defiance. Flags with 3 sevens waved at rallies. Uniformed men marched in formation. Horses carried leaders across fields like generals surveying their troops. For many supporters, the AWB represented resistance against what they called the erosion of Afrikaner culture, against democracy, against a future they could not accept. For others, it was extremism, a dangerous refusal to accept that history had moved on. The AWB grew louder as South Africa edged toward a new era. While the country negotiated its future behind conference tables, Eugene and his followers filled stadiums with chants and rhetoric. The more society sought reconciliation, the more he escalated his message. In 1989, as talks of South African democracy gained momentum, Terre Blanch delivered one of his most infamous speeches. He painted a world where the white Afrikaner was under siege. He claimed that only action, radical, uncompromising action, could secure their survival. And the crowds responded, not with reason, not with debate, but with loyalty, fear, rage, hope twisted into ideology. Yet the world outside continued to change. Apartheid's pillars were cracking. Mandela was released. Negotiations were underway. But in Terre Blanch's world, surrender was not an option. The man who had once been a policeman was now the general of a movement that refused to accept that the war had ended, that peace had arrived.
After 27 years, his head was high and his fist was clenched. Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison today like a chief of state, flanked by his first lady and by the men who'd been hired to protect him.
When Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison in February 1990, South Africa did not explode. It did not descend into civil war. It did not burn. For Eugene Terre Blanch, that was the first miscalculation. For years, he had warned that releasing Mandela would mean chaos, bloodshed, the end of white South Africa, but as the newly freed ANC leader began speaking the language of negotiation instead of revenge, the political landscape shifted in a direction the AWB had not prepared for. The government did not collapse. It negotiated. Between 1990 and 1993, talks intensified between the National Party government and liberation movements. A democratic constitution was being drafted. The machinery of apartheid was being dismantled piece by piece. Terre Blanch believed the process itself was illegitimate. If elections were coming, they had to be stopped.
Members of the neo-Nazi resistance movement, the AWB, stormed the World Trade Center armed with pistols, rifles and shotguns.
In June 1993, at the World Trade Center in Kempton Park, where multi-party negotiations were underway, AWB members arrived in armed vehicles. They rammed through the glass entrance of the building and stormed inside. It was not spontaneous, it was calculated. A show of force meant to disrupt the talks and demonstrate that armed resistance was real. But once inside, there was no takeover, no seizure of power. Negotiators were shaken, but they continued. Security restored order. The talks resumed. The message was unmistakable. The transition would not be stopped by spectacle. For the first time on a national stage, the AWB looked less like a government in waiting and more like an isolated militia. And yet, the movement did not retreat. As 1994 approached, Terre Blanch intensified his warnings. He spoke of betrayal by the ruling National Party, of Afrikaners being handed over, of the need to prepare for self-determination. But momentum had shifted beyond him. In April 1994, South Africans queued in numbers never seen before. Black South Africans who had been excluded for generations stood beside white citizens in the same lines. The image itself contradicted the apocalyptic future the AWB had predicted. The election proceeded peacefully. When Nelson Mandela was inaugurated as president, the transfer of power happened without civil war, without national collapse, without the uprising Terre Blanch had forecast. That was the turning point. The democratic breakthrough did not destroy South Africa, but it did undermine the foundation of his movement. The AWB had thrived on urgency, on the idea that catastrophe was imminent. When catastrophe failed to arrive, fear began to lose its edge. Support softened.
Boere krijgsgevangenes wat in die gevangenis is, voel dat ons het eintlik baie van ons tyd gemors binne die AWB.
Attendants thinned. The language of armed resistance sounded increasingly detached from reality. Eugene Terre Blanch had built his identity on confrontation with the state. Now the state had transformed and survived. South Africa entered a new political era. And for the first time since founding the AWB, Terre Blanch was no longer shaping events. He was reacting to them.
We can talk about a peaceful South Africa.
The country had crossed a line it would not uncross, and he had failed to stop it.
Trailing the colors of the new South African flag.
For how can a man die better, facing fearful odds? For the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods.
The democratic transition did not end Eugene Terre Blanch's activism, but it stripped it of inevitability. After 1994, the ABW no longer stood at the center of a national crisis. The elections had happened, power had transferred, the state had not collapsed, and without imminent revolution, the movement began to fracture. Some supporters drifted back into private life. Others pursued politics through smaller right-wing parties. A few remained loyal, but the crowds were smaller now. Terre Blanch refused to fade quietly. Throughout the late 1990s, he continued to speak of Afrikaner self-determination, of a Volksstaat, an independent homeland for white Afrikaners. But the national conversation had shifted toward reconstruction, reconciliation, and economic survival. He was no longer confronting a collapsing regime. He was confronting irrelevance. Then came the incident that would redefine him.
Yes, just like a dog. You have to go to the dog stage. That's all that you have to do.
We must see the law. See, being done to these people like Mr. Terre Blanch.
In 2001, Eugene Terre Blanch was convicted of assault and attempted murder after attacking a black petrol station worker and later assaulting a security guard. The case shocked even some of his remaining supporters. The man who had framed himself as a disciplined defender of order now stood convicted of violent criminal behavior. He was sentenced to prison. For a figure who had built his image on strength and defiance, incarceration was a severe blow. The symbolism cut deep. The former paramilitary leader was now subject to the authority of the very democratic state he had rejected. Prison did not make him a martyr in the way some might have expected. It exposed vulnerability. The myth of the unstoppable nationalist began to erode. When he was released on parole in 2004, South Africa was 10 years into democracy. A new generation was coming of age. The urgency of the early 1990s had faded into history books and political analysis. The AWB still existed, but it no longer commanded national attention. Terre Blanch attempted a political return. He gave interviews. He re-entered public debate. He spoke again about land crime and minority rights. But the country had moved into a different phase of its story. His rhetoric no longer shaped the national mood. It echoed from the margins. Financial difficulties followed. Reports described declining resources and internal divisions within the AWB. The movement that once paraded in uniformed columns struggled to maintain cohesion. The spectacle had faded. The horses were gone. The grand rallies were memories. What remained was a man tied to a past moment, one that had already passed. By the late 2000s, Terre Blanch lived largely on his farm near Venterdrop. The image was quieter now, less theatrical, more isolated. The revolutionary storm he had predicted had never arrived. The independent Afrikaner homeland had not materialized. The political system he despised had endured. History had not turned back. It had continued without him. And in that continuation, the distance between the myth of Eugene Terre Blanch and the reality of his circumstances became impossible to ignore. The fall was not sudden, it was gradual, a slow narrowing of influence, a shrinking audience, a fading echo of a louder decade. By the end, he was no longer confronting the state, he was confronting obscurity. And for a man who had built his life on being seen, being heard, being feared, obscurity may have been the heaviest sentence of all.
A final farewell to one of South Africa's apartheid stalwarts. To the thousands here, he was a great leader, and his murder last week came as a shock.
Kill the Boers, kill the farmers.
As I said, nah, leave us alone. What do you want with us? Do you want us out of the country? This is our land. Our blood, our sweat has been put in the soil. You won't get rid of us.
There's going to be a war soon. Yes, definitely. Not even, we are not saying it to frighten anyone. We're saying it because it's going to happen.
On the evening of April 3rd, 2010, Eugene Terre Blanch was killed on his farm outside Venterdrop. He was 69 years old. According to police reports, 2 farm workers, a man and a teenager, were arrested shortly after. Authorities stated the dispute was related to unpaid wages. There was no evidence of a coordinated political assassination, no organized uprising, no insurgency, just an argument that turned violent. For a man who had spent decades predicting civil war, his death did not come at the hands of a revolutionary movement. It came in isolation, inside his own home. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In the early hours after the news broke, there were immediate fears of racial retaliation.
I'm worried, but we are ready. Let me say we are ready for them.
Our leader has been brutally murdered in his house.
It is important that all leaders who lead this country from different political formations and non-governmental organizations should unite in the call for calm in this country. I know for a fact that those who have been closer, who are close to Mr. Terre Blanch, they must be feeling a pain. But it is this time that we've got to exercise our leadership responsibility to make this country unite in calling for stop of violence.
The ANC has now asked all wings of its party to stop singing controversial songs, which some blame for incitement that led to the killing.
South Africa had just witnessed heated political rhetoric surrounding the controversial struggle song Dubul Ibhunu. Tensions were already sensitive. Commentators warned that his killing could ignite unrest among right-wing supporters, but the unrest did not materialize. There were statements of condemnation from across the political spectrum. Government officials called for calm. Even long-standing ideological opponents emphasized stability.
The Afrikaner Resistance Movement has promised not to seek revenge and has called for calm.
The country did not fracture. It absorbed the shock and continued. His funeral drew supporters. AWB flags reappeared. Old symbols resurfaced for a moment. Speeches invoked betrayal, land, identity, and loss. For those who remained loyal, he was still a martyr of a defeated cause. But outside that circle, the national mood was markedly restrained. By 2010, South Africa was 16 years into democracy. The crises facing the country were no longer about whether majority rule would survive. They were about unemployment, corruption, service delivery, and inequality. The battle Terre Blanch had prepared for belonged to another era. His death did not trigger a revolution. It did not reverse the democratic order. It did not awaken the mass mobilization he had once commanded. Instead, it marked the quiet end of a political chapter that had already been closing for years. In many ways, the man who once rode on horseback at the head of uniformed rallies became a historical reference point, a symbol of a defiant minority in a transitional moment. His life traced the arc of resistance to change. His death confirmed that the change had endured. There is a difference between influence and noise. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Eugene Terre Blanch had influence. He tapped into fear during a moment of uncertainty. He mobilized anger during negotiations that felt existential to some communities. But history moved forward, and movements built on stopping time rarely survive the clock. When South Africa stepped into democracy in 1994, it did not become perfect. It became complicated, unequal, violent in places, politically turbulent. The promises of freedom did not erase struggle, but it did not become the apocalyptic war he predicted. That may be the clearest measure of his legacy, not what he built, but what failed to happen. The country he fought against continued to exist, and in that continuation, the myth of imminent collapse faded. Eugene Terre Blanch spent much of his life warning that history was moving in the wrong direction. In the end, history simply moved past him.